Eli.
How are you, Spencer?
I'm doing well, thank you, my friend. What's going on?
Well, it is a busy week with everything going on right now.
That's right.
I have a column out today on all the apologies from the Democrats.
Yeah, I saw that column. I thought it was interesting. It certainly seems to be an era over the last couple weeks of former supporters of the war repudiating their positions, and I speak from experience as one who is into that. So why don't you tell people what you wrote about, and then I had some questions about it, and we can just sort of go from there.
Well, my problem, I mean, I got the idea for writing this after reading Peter Beinart's last TRB column, I mean, we both know and very much respect Peter Beinart, but he says in that column that we should have learned that when other liberal democracies oppose the war, and I was referring, I think, to France and Germany mainly, that this means that our interventionist fantasies should have been curbed at that point, and that you need to have a kind of consensus among free countries in order to do these sorts of future regime changes. And my problem with it was that there's quite a bit of evidence that the French, in particular, which host the BNP Paribas Bank, was implicated at probably at very high levels, at least at Charles Pasqua, the Interior Minister, and we know many associates of President Chirac, in the scam of Saddam Hussein to deliberately malnourish his people and to sort of game the UN oil for food system through these vouchers that the French bank was in custodian of. So that was my first problem with it. And the second problem is that if you look at
just hang on, just to clarify about that, what you mean to say is that you found Peter's point about curbing one's enthusiasm for regime change to be in a sense, because of dissent from other liberal democracies, to be a bit naive or facile in lieu of the actual behavior of these other liberal democracies.
Well, what I'm saying is that the UN as an institution was so compromised by trying to ensure that Saddam would use his oil profits not to procure dual-use technologies and other things to build weapons of mass destruction, that this enormous sanctions regime was such a nest of corruption that it's a bit of a dodge to say that I only support regime changes or I only support interventions when the UN agrees, when we have evidence, now that we've seen a lot of this documentation with the Volcker report and other investigations, that in a lot of cases, while we don't have a direct smoking gun, I think we have enough circumstantial evidence to suggest that some of these votes were bought off. And more importantly, that state of affairs in 2003 was terrible. I mean, it was horrible for the Iraqi people. While there were very few analysts who didn't think Saddam was compiling the arsenal that the Bush administration said he was, almost everybody just assumed by the fact that he was willing to endure the sanctions that he must be up to something. And so it struck me that if you didn't support that state of affairs, which I certainly didn't, and Peter Beinart makes reference to Kanan Makia, someone who we both admire, he certainly didn't, then there were very good liberal reasons to support a regime change. You can quibble, as I think I would and almost everyone would at this point, about how you went about that. But the decision to want to revoke Saddam Hussein's sovereignty and to do so with allies after the UN Security Council could not agree on the second sanctions struck me as, that was not the issue. You shouldn't have all this contrition lead people to regret the idea that, there were certain states and certain state actors that really were just a menace to the international system itself.
But I think from the way I read Peter's column that was exactly what he's trying to work through. In fact, the idea that there were certain liberal principles that he applied that led to this disaster, and he's trying to think back from there, as I think is an admirable intellectual effort, and really speaks very well of Peter's intellectual honesty. and figure out where exactly it was that he went wrong. And that impulse hasn't, I believe, from the column, led Peter to say that one needs total unanimity from the community of democracies or from the United Nations. But in particular circumstances, it does, in fact, raise the standards for overcoming these objections significantly. The trouble is that it's always going to be difficult to articulate on the level of first principles when to go about a given intervention, because these things will always inevitably be complicated. What seems to be, in retrospect, the right position from the perspective of a liberal internationalist order is that one would have needed a much greater degree, if we're to take the humanitarian argument for the war seriously, as I know you do, I did, and Peter did, a much greater level of sort of, one hesitates to say that there wasn't direct abuse by the Saddam Hussein regime on the Iraqi people, but a more active component of a genocidal strategy. Basically, the question that I've tried to think through that I've not really got a satisfactory answer for anyone is what to do in the cases of rogue states or rogue actors that are engaged in what you might kind of call a slow bore or brush fire humanitarian emergency, where genocidal conditions don't apply, but the apparatus of state harassment and the abrogation of human rights is so severe that the sort of normal practices of the international order clearly won't curb them. And I don't really have an answer to that, but I have to say, from the Iraq experience, that a more or less unilateral, with the obvious caveats of the few allies that we did have, and more or less preemptive invasion and occupation can't really be a sustainable answer. And that's where I think Peter is trying to think through. I don't really think he proposed what one might call a Beinart doctrine. There are certainly alternatives one can take from this. It's a perfectly consistent position to say, from perhaps a neoconservative perspective, one need not repudiate unilateral American interventions. I think that would be the wrong position, but nevertheless, it's still a coherent position that, the only failings of the Iraq War are failings of implementation. Or one could take a more robust liberal internationalist perspective and say, in fact, when you have these slow-bore humanitarian emergencies, one really must defer to either, pick your appropriate international forum, be it NATO, be it the United Nations Security Council. I think different liberals would have a different answer to that. But nevertheless, the answer that was on display in 2003, for whatever seemingly lofty purposes different people attached to it, has simply been just discredited by the fact of the war.
Well, my problem with Peter Beinart's argument is also the kind of tone and the fact that it's an apology to the left of his party, whereas, I mean, in some respects, and Peter's not doing this directly, but in some respects, and to broaden it, with some of what Hillary has been doing and John Edwards with his apology. The apologizers are apologizing to these, Nader voters from 2000 and people at least who are in international affairs who were on the left, who tried, had mock war crimes tribunals for Madeleine Albright because they prevented Milosevic from cleansing Kosovo of Albanians. And I think that liberals have to also be aware, as when Peter started writing after the 2004 election, he started in this direction sort of as an attack on, elements of the Move On faction, and then he kind of ended up doing this listening tour, and because I really like Peter's writing, I don't understand why he listens to some of these people. Because there is going to be, I think, a real split eventually after Bush, because Bush keeps these elements together, but there is going to be a split in the Democratic tent between the liberal internationalists who still think that there should be robust sort of American values that would drive America to use force or to use its power to intervene and to be an international player, and then a kind of a far left group that thinks America is incapable of acting in a way that would benefit anybody on a human rights grounds, and then a kind of realist wing now of the Bush 1 types who've sort of migrated to the Democrats, who sort of look at, wars for oil and these sorts of things and said, so what? That is, at least it makes sense to me. A war for democracy, that's crazy. So I think that because I think Peter is such a persuasive polemicist and such a persuasive writer, it pains me to see him so concerned with the opinions of those I might find on the Daily Kos site and so forth.
Well, I just to respond to that a bit, knowing a bit about the way Peter approached the issue contemporaneously, he found, and I think rather to his credit, that upon further examination of his previous arguments in light of events, that basically they had become somewhat untenable, and he tried to work back from the problem. I think you'd be making a mistake and doing a disservice to Peter to suggest that he's pandering to the far left.
I'm not saying he's pandering. I'm just saying.
As I found out, I'll tell you just the other day in response to his column, I posted something on my own blog just praising what he had written and the fact that he was working through these issues in such a forthright and candid manner. And I said to people, some of whom are my readers, I hope, given the acrimony that a lot of people have for Peter Beinart, that they'll be able to see Peter more in the way that I see him, as trying very openly to work out a complex intellectual problem and seeing where he went wrong and adjusting from it. And those guys just aren't going to like Peter anyway. I don't think he's writing to appease anybody.
It's not about who likes who. I mean, and on a political level, certainly John Edwards, who I remember really liking in 2004 because he spoke so straightforwardly about how awful Saddam was and the importance of the sort of very grand mission, which is clearly scaled back now, and to sort of see him, flitting around on things like Iran and everything else, it's just, I just don't think that. Let me put it like this. I write for the New York Sun, and I come at it from, I suppose, a neoconservative perspective. But I also would like to see the Democratic Party get back to eschewing some of the elements within it that I just think ultimately could really almost sort of marginalize themselves from a discussion about American national security. Because if you take the Chomsky view, and if you look at the view that you get,
I don't think anyone in the basic liberal discourse of any significance takes a Chomskyan view. Don't you think that's a misrepresentation of the situation?
Listen, Noam Chomsky is clearly a man of the left, and he's attacked liberals, and there is a long tradition of that. But there is creeping into a lot of the Democratic Party's sort of anti-war rhetoric and discussion of these things. There seems to, at least to me, when I come across this stuff as at least a discussion of sort of the discourse about the threats and our enemies today and so forth, there is this sense that really there's very little America can do abroad that would be good for the world, and I just don't think that's true. I mean, I think that there are examples of American interventions that a classic example would be Panama, for example, where we can restore a democratic order to a certain extent, and I just think that the party is sort of
about that, but okay,
slipping in this direction where they would sort of view this kind of thing impossible. That's not the same as everything that Chomsky writes. It's not Z Magazine, but I think it's certainly approaching it.
Well, I suppose we should, at this point, I think we could kind of come back to that, because what we should probably do is just to take the discussion down from such a high altitude.
Yes.
Let's talk a bit about how, in fact, this has led to what I think is probably fair to say, at least the greatest foreign policy disaster since Vietnam, and many would contend the greatest foreign policy disaster for the United States, full stop. Has led us to a point where, in fact, we're barely even discussing Iraq over the last couple days, or the last couple weeks, rather, and discussing more Iran. And what's been so interesting to me about the way this debate has taken shape is that it seems the Bush administration has veered from an Iraq-centric policy or an Iraq-centric strategy in the Middle East to an Iran-centric strategy. And I'd like to know how you think this complicates what the neoconservatives had talked about for quite a long period of time about transformational democracy in the region. The big diplomatic push of 2007, fully endorsed by the Bush administration, by the president, has been to cobble together precisely this coalition of mostly Sunni autocracies that they're calling, that Condoleezza Rice has been talking about to journalists and to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as moderates in the region against the extremists in the region, which they're defining as being allied with Iran, are all more or less under the Iranian orbit, except for Hamas, all of which are Shiite. And it just struck me as an overwhelmingly odd turn of events for several reasons. First because, and we can talk about this in our next segment, Al-Qaeda is suddenly absent from this picture. And second of all, we had heard from Bush in the second inaugural address and throughout the administration that really the root cause problem was an absence of democracy in the Middle East, and all of a sudden, the traditional enemies of the allies of the United States, Egypt, Jordan, the Saudis, and so forth, were indirectly responsible for creating the conditions that had led to 9/11. And now, given that we've seen Iran stretch its legs in the region more, that argument is now, if not completely abandoned, marginalized in favor of cobbling together an anti-Iranian coalition in the region that consists of, surprise, surprise, Egypt, Jordan, the Saudis, with sort of the Iraq factions hobbled in this kind of netherworld. I'm thinking of Syria in particular as being someone the administration will at least formally deal with as moderate, but certainly being, if not an outright proxy of Iran, certainly rather sympathetic to it. And I'm wondering what you think this really means for both Iraq, for whatever it is we're going to do for Iran, and then if we can get a little bit back up into the clouds for a minute, as more or less a repudiation of the neoconservative argument by probably the most neoconservative administration you're likely to see in our lifetimes.
Well, the story is that the American Enterprise Institute is digging tunnels between Iraq and Iran wide enough to have large tanks invade Tehran any day now, Spencer. No, I joke. But that, if you read the British press, this is where it's going. Anyway, a couple things with what you just said. One, the president never said he wanted to liberate the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, or he never said he wanted. He never said he believed that their American allies, or I should say more precisely, Sunni sovereign families like the House of Saud, that were aligned with America, for the most part, on a lot of other issues, would reform through allowing us to give fairly paltry amounts of money to sort of state-approved NGOs and agreeing to hold some elections that, for the most part, really were not that significant and were not real contests of power. And having lived in Cairo for the legislative elections, I can tell you that they were the fact that the first round of the legislative elections were very competitive, and then they suddenly became uncompetitive, and there was very little protest from the State Department, showed that even this modest reform effort was not ever a serious policy initiative for the administration. But moving to where we are now, I think that Cy Hirsch and yourself and others are wrong to say that we are addressing Iran as a threat at the expense of Al-Qaeda, and you would have to choose one or the other. In some cases, we know the Iranians have cooperated with Al-Qaeda. In other cases, the Iranians have cooperated with us against Al-Qaeda, but they've proven that they are willing to, depending on the sort of tenor of the relationship at the time, work with both sides. And I also would say,
let me just jump in. Can I just
play
jump in
both
here for 1
sides at the
second?
same time, I would say, which is to say that, send their diplomats to say nice things to us about Al-Qaeda and how they're going to cooperate, and then have another element of their regime, like the Quds Force, working with Sunni jihadists against us. So,
but let me just jump in for 1 second there, because were I to assume everything you just said about Iran's relationship to Al-Qaeda, that would still lead me to believe that the reason, therefore, to focus on Iran as a security threat would be as a subsidiary or a derivative to dealing with al-Qaeda. So that would lead me to believe that you further think that the real basic problem remains al-Qaeda. And then my question would still stand as being why one would then need to elevate Iran to the status of the organization that, as you would put it, have the occasional dealing with and can be flipped away from. It would seem then that Iran just simply is not in the category of threat to al-Qaeda if you're going to make the case that the degree to which Iran threatens the United States hinges primarily on or hinges at all on their relationship to al-Qaeda.
Well, let me address that. The reason why the threat of Iran has elevated so much has to do with the fact that they continue to enrich uranium in a clandestine program that they fessed up to in 2003 on the condition that they wouldn't enrich uranium, and they have sort of violated this agreement with the IAEA and a diplomatic process that is approved by the Europeans and even the Russians and the Chinese, which clearly are less concerned than President Bush is. So that's the first thing, that this emerged as a crisis because of the bad behavior of the Iranians, and secondly, because it's a state that's run by complete and total terrorist lunatics. And that is something that I think that the people who are making the argument about how, well, if we just change the tenor, we should maybe cooperate with them against al-Qaeda, I would like for the president to pass a law that says all national security journalists get neck massages. But I know that that's not going to happen. So we have to deal with Iran as it is. In 2005, the supreme leader essentially stole an election that was already pretty much fixed from the beginning and put in as the front man for this regime one of the looniest, most hateful, anti-Semitic, anti-American, anti-civilization leaders that we can imagine, and we should not have any bones about it. This guy Ahmadinejad is not there because Iranians liked his reform message. That's a lie. He's there because he was chosen by people who fixed an election, and at the time, 3 of his challengers complained about the fact that the election was fixed, and the newspapers that printed their actual concerns were then shut down. Furthermore,
no one.
Yeah, I'm just saying, the Iranians themselves have a lot to do with this story as to why they're a threat. In addition to the fact that while they don't control al-Qaeda, nobody would say that they're the sponsor of al-Qaeda, they also work with other terrorists, and they arm other terrorists, and they're pretty open about it. So they are a problem because of their own behavior.
Well, one would not argue that Iranian behavior is irrelevant to this discussion. Or irrelevant to a consideration of a threat from Iran. But the trouble is that we're drifting ever closer to rather now our third war, or our third military confrontation, but more importantly, towards a rather undistinguished or undifferentiated conception of what, in fact, the jihadist enemy is. I mean, I tried earlier in something that I wrote to try and just say, like, if we have to put some kind of, definition on what it is we're fighting, I would say that would be an anti-Western Salafist jihadist ideology, which is to say a certain bin Ladenist critique of the world that Iran does not play a part in. One can quibble with that, but to argue that Iran's to argue that the Bush administration is elevating its assessment of the threat from Iran and criticizing that is not the same as saying that there is no threat or there is no danger. It's to say that we've kind of got this rather overwhelming and immediate threat from al-Qaeda to deal with, and that's kind of big enough. And on top of that, we've got the challenge of extricating ourselves from Iraq, which is also kind of big enough. And whatever we have to fear from Iran in terms of its nuclear program, we have a sufficient amount of time. The best intelligence estimates we have put, I think, at most like 5 years away from Iranian nuclear capability. And second of all, there still remains this diplomatic outreach, as you mentioned, that at least some observers feel, provided that there is a rather serious threat of international sanctions against Iran.
Spencer, if these international agreements mean anything...
It has to do with modifying the regime's behavior at least somewhat, and so that just raises the question of whether we're not, in fact, shooting ourselves in the foot by deciding that our entire diplomatic and regional strategy has to be reoriented around Iran.
Well, I don't think our entire diplomatic and regional strategy is necessarily going to reorient it towards Iran at the expense of fighting al-Qaeda. Well, in Anbar province, at least early reports suggest that we're doing a good job of taking care of AQI, and this, I guess, segues to the next topic.
You should say what that is.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and we're obviously, because the Pakistanis cut deals in Waziristan with with the Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, they're emerging as a threat again, and they have another safe haven there. So, I would say it's sort of a mixed bag on the question of Al-Qaeda, but I mean, all the time, the lone hegemon, this is superpower in the world, is going to have more than one threat. And I would say the threat of the people who kind of invented modern Islamic terrorism, who are, playing an awful role in sabotaging Lebanon, who have sent arms to the ICU, the Islamic Courts Union in Mogadishu, who, we can quibble about the degree, but I don't think we can really argue that they're certainly playing a role in fomenting the ethnic cleansing in Baghdad and working with various militias affiliated with the Shia that undermine the authority of their government. They're just a menace to the region and to the world, and if they have a nuclear weapon, they'll be more of a menace. That strikes me as a pretty high-order threat, and for the president to try to respond to it diplomatically, largely through financial sanctions, and largely through diplomacy right now, it seems very appropriate. It does. We live in a very big country with a government that's capable of doing more than one thing at once.
I think if you were to make an argument about this based on Bush's competence, you would really find yourself shooting yourself in the foot. I mean,
he's the president, Spencer. That's the president we've got right now.
Yes.
I'm sure you'd like him to sort of abdicate authority and resign, but, he's not going to do that. So for the next 2 years, he's going to try to deal with threats that everybody should agree are threats. Anybody who would argue right now that the Iranians really, that the people are hyping the threat from Iran, they have, on their Revolution Day, state-run television, things about, we've just enriched more uranium. Isn't this wonderful? They're supposed to be stopping that enrichment, and the UN Security Council unanimously told them, cut it out, and they ignore everything. So at a certain point, I think we have to understand that they're not just reacting to Bush. They have their own plan. They have their own designs. They know what they want to do.
But that's not the issue so much. Is the question of what Bush is doing? Is it more likely to result in a greater regional conflagration, or is it more likely to arrest the problem? And I would suggest that it's not likely to, first of all, stop an Iranian nuclear program that we have a fair amount of time to deal with, and second of all, one makes strategy by prioritizing problems. That isn't to say that one ignores a problem. It is to say that the better part of valor would be to find less confrontational ways of saying to the Iranians, perhaps there is some greater interest that we share in Iraq or on some other issue, perhaps Al-Qaeda, and then without taking their word for it, you find out what the price would be for your interests there. And that's what frightens me about seeing where we're going forward in Iraq, particularly as you mentioned the issue of Iranian backing for Shiite militias. Well, several of these militias are precisely run by the political parties that benefit by the political process in Iraq and play us, as much as they can, and we've been more or less willing participants in that fraudulence. And so the idea that we would be confronting, let me finish the point. The idea that we would be confronting Iran in terms of trying to get them to lower their profile in the region while simultaneously helping political parties that no matter what will be, if not loyal to Iran, more simpatico to Iran than us, is crazy.
Spencer, they don't have a right to spread their murderous ideology and fund terrorists because they don't play by the international system's rules. It's time to impose second and third class international citizenship on the Islamic Republic. And as someone who's spent a lot of time covering the indigenous opposition there, I think that there are opportunities, if it doesn't come from America, that you can use diplomacy in such a way that would help the people who have had their government stolen from them. And that's what's happened. I mean, that's the other thing, is that there was an argument to be made in 2002 and 2003, when at least Khatami was in charge, though he was ineffective, that there were people who were interested in even having a deal with the United States. Those people have been crushed, Spencer. Everybody who was a reformer, who was in the Majlis affiliated with Khatami in 2004, was told they couldn't run for re-election, and everybody that replaced them are just these lunatic thugs. So they've made their decision. They don't want to be part of the Western world. They don't want to negotiate. And I just think that sometimes that your quarter can't take no for an answer. And they say it every day. Every day they're like, it's time for you to leave Iraq. We are going to destroy America. We're going to destroy Israel. Every day they say that. Every day the Iranian Ayatollahs are saying this. And the only people who listen to it are the guys on my side. And it's like you're sort of, I don't know, it's not the reality-based community anymore. I'm taking that word away from you guys. You're not the reality-based community. Something else.
No. I'm afraid that neoconservatives don't get to tell anybody that they're out of touch with reality. Given that,
I think it's projection.
Projection?
Projection.
So, you just had basically everything you believe come crashing down on you in Iraq. The wages of your worldview have led to the greatest national security disaster for the United States, self-inflicted national security wound for the United States, at least in 30 years. And somehow, because one would take the position that it's nuts to simultaneously confront Iran in the region and turn Iraq, not by design but by default, over to its allies, is nuts, is somehow outside the reality.
No, it's to pretend that there's a deal that's waiting with the Iranians if we just spoke nicely to them. The only one who believes that is the guy the Iranians put in New York named Javad Zarif, who's paid to sort of say this sort of thing and stroke the erogenous zones of diplomats who desperately want to believe that. But it's just not true. I mean, it's overwhelming evidence. I'm just pointing out that I would also like to cut a deal with the Iranians so that they stopped all this behavior. I'm not interested in necessarily... I mean, first of all, there's no option to invade Iran. That's not on the table. But I know that if you bombed the Iranian nuclear facilities, you would be doing a great disservice, and you'd be setting back the Iranian opposition by years. You'd be terrible for them. So I don't think that bombing the Iranians is that's not a great option either. But I'm saying that you have to deal with what you're dealing with.
I mean, that's insane.
But no, I'm saying you have to deal with the Iranians as they are. And as for my worldview crashing down, I mean, it's amazing to me, Spencer, because we've had this argument before, not on a Blogging Heads sort of discussion, but I see the failures of Iraq and the failures of the implementation is the fact that the president never implemented a particular strategy and allowed everybody to implement their strategies in various regions of the country, so it became this, the mess in many ways that it is, because there was never a clear understanding on any of the basic questions, whether it was de-Ba'athification, whether it was the type of elections that one would have, whether it was the exiles that were going to be supported by which branches of the government. So it's a far more complicated question of the ideology that wreaked all this. And plus, there's also a role that the foreign actors who have sabotaged Iraq are playing, whether it's al-Qaeda in Iraq or the Jordanian banks that have funded the Ba'athist wing of this terror insurgency, or for that matter, the Islamic Republic of Iran and their Quds Force. So there's a lot of blame to go around. I'm not going to say that everything is dandy in Iraq right now, but it's not necessarily the failure of a worldview that you can like sort of reduce it all to one ideology.
No, as a matter of fact, you can, because the troubles in Iraq are foreseeable and are playing out. And the inability of neoconservatism, as you know, Bush is going to be I'm sorry that you don't feel it's been properly put into practice, because you're never going to have a more forthrightly neoconservative administration than you do right now. It's the failure of the worldview to properly adjust to these foreseeable problems and objections and nefarious actors as it is. And so it seems to me quite like arguing that communism was never properly implemented on the earth to sort of preciously say that neoconservatism is unimplicated in everything that's been going on in Iraq over the last 4 years and will continue to go on for quite a while. But I suppose let's actually now move to the idea of the actual security threat that we continue to face from Al-Qaeda. I think here we'll find much greater common ground. We've seen just today Dick Cheney going to Bagram Air Base, staying the night because he was unable to get to Kabul last night, and a suicide bomber blowing himself up right outside of Bagram. And the reason why Cheney was in the region was to pressure Pervez Musharraf of Pakistan to, we can sort of read the tea leaves here, to either, one could say, more properly enforce in a diplomatic parlance the Waziristan agreement of last September, which basically put a ceasefire into effect between Pakistan and the more tribal regions that have been sheltering Al-Qaeda, or one could take the alternative view and saying that Pakistan should just rip up the agreement and re-invade. And what strikes me as the more significant issue here is that where we stand right now is basically in a pre-September 11th position relative to Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. You've got a situation in which you recognize that Al-Qaeda's sort of what you might call Al-Qaeda prime, the Bin Ladens and the Zawaris and so forth that are in this particular part of Pakistan or presumed to be nearby, are in a position of amassing strength. They have a greater capacity apparently to communicate, according to a recent report in the New York Times, than they had in recent years, and surely mean to do us harm, and even without the full-on sponsorship of Afghanistan, have shown themselves over the past 6 years to be quite capable of doing so. And the one thing that we could do, at least that would carry the greatest probability of wiping this network out in this region, would be invading it with American ground forces, and that for a variety of both diplomatic and military reasons is completely unfeasible. And so it's illustrative in the sense that it clarifies that even after 2 wars that we've launched, the nub of the jihadist problem can still very well escape the more desirable military measures that we would want to see implemented, and that it just leaves us with this really yawning question of what in the world can you do about a problem like Pakistan?
Well, it's a huge problem. I mean, I think that there was never really an option to invade Pakistan because they do have nuclear weapons. One of the reasons why, obviously, I don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons is that I would never want for that there to at least be leverage in the background. And one of the reasons I don't think America should precipitously withdraw from Iraq is that I think similar kinds of al-Qaeda safe havens would probably emerge in Iraq if America just sort of followed the Murtha strategy and withdrew to Okinawa, I think is what he recently said. So, but I think also this is a problem that demonstrates the wisdom of the great hero of liberalism, a man by the name of Natan Sharansky, who says and warns the West. He says in his book, The Case for Democracy, that these deals that we think that are good deals that we cut with despots like Musharraf are in the end not going to work out for us, because it is true that he's got to a certain extent appease the Islamists and al-Qaeda sympathizers in his own intelligence service in order to remain in power. That's the deal that he's got to cut. And whether it's Arafat Musharraf, or in the end, Prince Abdullah, or King Abdullah, as it were, in Saudi Arabia. In all of these cases, these deals that we think are strengthening us in this war against Al-Qaeda, in the end are going to burn us, not just because they are ruling over unfree states that I think are one of the chief root causes of why young Muslims would turn to Islamism and turn to Salafism, but it's also because, in the end, they have to keep their options open. And I think that's what Musharraf did when he signed these accords with the sort of Waziristan Governing Council in June, and then the second one in September.
But the trouble with accepting that argument is that it presumes that there's some alternative apparatus one can deal with in Pakistan or some political alternative. Musharraf has done really, really well over the last, basically since coming to power in 1999, of ensuring that he is always going to be the repository of a more reasonable, one might say, or to put it less euphemistically, Western pliable Pakistan. Basically, Musharraf had sufficiently cracked down on what remained of a parliament, so that what remained was basically an Islamist council called the MMA, and they really stand as the alternative. I can tell you from my own work, however limited it's been on the Pakistan question, what remains of any sort of infrastructure in Pakistan outside of the control of Musharraf is more likely to be infrastructure that's manipulated by Al-Qaeda than it is by any more, say, democratically minded Pakistani coalition. So to say, I just think, from this perspective, like it shows not that Sharansky's argument is apt, but that it's in fact orthogonal to the real question, because it just gets you basically this point of whining about dictators rather than having any course of action for leading strategy in a way that can actually successfully take account of both national security and getting rid of the dictator.
Listen, I wanted in the more halcyon days of this administration for the president to support or to figure out a clever way of getting lots of money and diplomatic support for the liberals that I had met throughout the Arab and Muslim world that would eventually become these sorts of reformers and so forth. And that's to say that, of course, America needs to have a relationship with Musharraf, but we shouldn't gull ourselves into thinking that the maintenance of that relationship alone is going to give us the security that we need. And to a certain extent, what I think that when you hear like a Flint Leverett or Lawrence Wilkerson talk about all the grand plans that they had in the first Bush administration that the neocons sort of sabotaged, what they wanted to do was to create a sort of ring of intelligence services and militaries and and institutions loyal to these dictators that would be our proxies in the fight against Al-Qaeda. And I think that it's a counterfactual at this point, but we also did this in a lot of ways. And I think that Pakistan is an example how that fails too in the end as well. And that ultimately there needs to be some strategy that leads to the liberalization of these countries.
Well, the trouble, to take the point about Pakistan, to keep it specific, the trouble is that there is no alternative to Musharraf. We often hear...
well, there's no alternative for now to Musharraf, but, it doesn't mean that
this is precisely what makes the issue, what makes it so immediate and so complex, is that you and I would both like to say, and I think all decent human beings around the planet, on the left and the right and wherever, would want to say, if there's an option of getting... some instant liberalization that will ultimately be a firm ally.
Spencer, I never said this was an instant liberalization. I know it's not an instant liberalization. I'm saying that
I think oftentimes we get too cute about who we would actually be empowering, particularly in the short term about this. But what I'm saying is there is nothing besides Musharraf. We often hear it said that you can't have a Musharraf policy instead of a Pakistan policy.
I'm not arguing for a regime
I'm inclined to be sympathetic to that. The trouble is that there's no alternative foreseeable aside from Musharraf. And as long as you've got a situation that's basically like that because of what Pakistan is. You really have very little choice but to say, the policy is this guy. And if there's an alternative, I'd like to know what it is.
What I'm saying is that we should have covered our bets. I'm not saying nobody wants regime. You can't do regime change in Egypt or any of these places. And I think that in many ways Saddam was very much of an exception, which we could get back to. But do we have a? We're running out of time. I did want to talk about Al Gore.
Before we get to Al Gore,
but I wasn't. I'm not saying let's overthrow Musharraf. I'm saying that don't put all of the eggs in that basket and say that the maintenance of that relationship is going to necessarily buy security, because he's going to make
the other basket. That's what I'm asking you. Where's the other basket?
Well, you've got to create that basket, but there are plenty of people in Pakistan, and I could probably speak more, fluently about this when it comes to Egypt, of people that we could have supported, and we can still support in Egypt that are not the Muslim Brotherhood, and that are also not the NDP in Egypt. So there's plenty of individuals, there's plenty of newspaper editors, there's plenty of rogue and maverick legislators, and that's why I'm so drawn to, we know a lot of the same people like Mithal al-Alusi. But I think that we need to find those people and figure out how to support them.
Well, let me just quickly say.
That's not an exclusion, by the way, to also working with what we have in the region to try to kill Al-Qaeda and other terrorists.
Well, just on that last point, because you mentioned Mithal, dear viewer, Mithal al-Alusi is probably the purest Iraqi liberal there is. And he is a parliamentarian, and he has a position of somewhat marginal status, if I'm not mistaken, within the Maliki administration. What I think is illustrative about al-Alusi is that if one were to suggest that America's policy toward Iraq should be the support of Mithal al-Alusi and his coalition, we will find ourselves basically supporting people who can neither win nor govern. And it's not out of a lack of sympathy for the Mithal al-Alusis of the world that I would think that's not the wisest course of action. It's because you end up with even worse consequences than you're trying to avoid by weaning ourselves off of dictators. Probably the best way one can wean ourselves off of dictators is to wean ourselves off of the oil that entrenches in the Middle East those dictators. And for that, I'd like to get your perspective on the fact that on Sunday, a movie that I haven't seen, I'm sorry to say, that makes me a very bad liberal, An Inconvenient Truth, won an Academy Award. And what do you think, Eli, the greater significance of a movie as bracing and
environmentalism? Conservative that you're going to see on the internet that's going to say, bravo Al Gore, and I love Al Gore as an Iraq war hawk. And I'll tell you why.
And I love Al Gore as an Iraq war dove. And then I'll tell you why.
There you go. Okay, yeah. I love Al Gore, and here's why. Because Al Gore has a plan to energize the netroots in America and the left and liberals of Europe to support the bankruptcy of all of Israel's enemies. And to me, this makes him a great hero of Zionism, and I wish him well in trying to get advanced democracies to impose carbon taxes and come up with alternative energies, because think about it, Spencer, who gets knocked out in that scenario once Al Gore's project succeeds? The Saudis, Iran, throw in Hugo Chavez. He's a neoconservative wet dream, Al Gore. And by the way, when he wasn't Al Gore, the guy who ran for president and just a guy, he was a super. They used to call him the third senator from New York. I voted for Al Gore in 2000 because I still have this. He wrote a letter to Ahmed Shalaby saying he was going to do everything he could to help liberate Iraq. So Al Gore has very good instincts, and I am starting to think, and this is maybe just me, Spencer, I'm starting to think that the whole Move On speech in 2002 was a ruse to try to get this segment of the American political landscape to support the ultimate weapon for the Israelis, which is to bankrupt the Saudis, the Iranians, and everyone else.
Cute as that is, what I find you're giving a bit of short shrift here is that, it's basically been an article of faith to the point of, ridicule by a lot of people in your camp for decades, if not years, on the left, that one should support alternative energies. If there's anything that I'm happy to say, it's good to see the neoconservatives coming around to. It's the idea that rather than ridicule Al Gore as ozone man or whatever Bush 1 called him, neoconservatives recognize that in fact American security interests and American energy interests can both better be served by at some point in the future weaning ourselves out of the age of hydrocarbon man. I wonder though why you still get, and it's probably because of a residual dislike of Gore, why you get so many people on the right still retaining, and in neoconservative circles especially, such a hostility to
Let me
why do you think that is?
Here you go. This is the problem. Al Gore's proposed solutions for getting this alternative energy is to submit American industry and the economy to international protocol administered through the United Nations. And so the way he gets there. But I'm just saying Al Gore as a cultural icon, as a figure that will inspire us and the next generation of scientists to come up with a car that runs on water or whatever it is fantastic.
Did you say the next generation, Eli, did you say the next generation of scientists or Zionists?
Zionist scientists, in fact.
Zionist scientists.
They're like Jonas Salk, these people who are going to create these cars that are going to run on bubbles or whatever it is.
They're going to run on watches, I think.
I'm just saying Al Gore. I think that ultimately that's the way to handle it, because I still believe that many of these regimes are a big cause, though they're not the exclusive cause of the terror threat to civilization and the Islamist threat, and specifically the threat to the existence of Israel. So if you think that Israel should exist and you want to deal with this threat, because Israel, it's made peace with Jordan, it's made peace with Egypt, and the problem is that there will always, it seems to be, sort of this. There is a strain of radicalism in the Middle East that is intricately linked with people, with the families that sort of profit from our addiction to oil. So I wish Al Gore the best of luck, except in. There's other ways to do it in terms of the regulatory elements of it, but just in terms of energizing people, it's great.
Well, I wonder if we've actually gotten you to say, basically, that what makes Al Gore so great is that his preferred view of the world would lead us, as the slogan goes, to a situation in which we have no more blood for oil. And that, you think, is what makes Al Gore such a neoconservative icon in particular.
Well, I prefer to phrase it as because he's going to bankrupt Israel's enemies. But, one side of the coin, the other side.
Right.
That's how I prefer to think of it. But I realize that this is probably an eccentric view, given sort of where things are coming from. But and also, I think another reason why some conservatives are sort of worried about Gore is because that while listen, I used to cover environmental policy when I first came to Washington, and I think the best way to explain it is that we don't know what the full effect of all of the carbon emissions are going to be on the environment. And Gore is correct in saying that this could be pretty bad, but those estimates of when the cities are going to flood is, I don't know. It's the science, I don't think, backs some of those things up. So it is a bit manipulative in that respect. But I welcome the manipulation, Spencer. It's fantastic. Manipulate away, Mr. Gore.
All right, so on that note, with Eli wanting to be manipulated by Al Gore and Al Gore being an icon that can unite liberals and neoconservatives and hopefully many others of you out there, we should probably end it. Thanks so much for watching this edition of Blogging Heads. Eli, we'll be taking this over to the Cypher for more.
Yes.
All right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.